Right, so the video on head marking versus dependent marking is done. The Q&A has been vanquished, which, by the way, I don't know why I came across as so depressingly deadpan in that video. Sorry about that. You'd think that talking to a camera would come kind of naturally after all this time, but I guess not. But anyway, with all of that dealt with, it is now time once again for me to descend into the dark catacombs of alien biospheres. But before we do that, I just wanted to squeeze in one more conlanging session, if possible, before I drop off the face of the earth for the next 2 months. So let's just go ahead and give a big thank you once again to all of the patrons, and pick up where we left off. So last time I was very excited by this idea I had, inspired by Ainu, of handling possession by way of relativized verbs. And you can see I've gone ahead and made some final forms for them. So I was originally thinking of using this gukka or gutta form for the applicative that would get attached to the akya, but after fiddling around with it for a while, it didn't quite work out in any favorable way. So instead, I'm now saying that this was the old word for to carry, which becomes the new word for to have, which becomes the standard verb to use for alienable possession. Whereas for inalienable possession, I just came up with this T prefix that gets stuck onto akya, so T in the proto-lang would have been some sort of postposition, something with a broadly commitative or maybe locative meaning. We'll figure out the specifics later. And more often than not, the akya form just gets reduced to a single vowel anyway, and with further shortening it just gives us these pretty simple forms. Now we could leave it at that as just a simple binary split of alienable and inalienable, but, and I think I said this last time as well, this opens up the possibility for using other verbs for more nuanced types of possession. So just like off the top of my head, maybe to buy could become a stem, specifically for something that you've purchased, and that could contrast with create or something like that. So if you said my book, depending on which possessive word you used, that would either mean the book that I wrote or the book that I bought from someone else. So I did a little bit of research, and apparently there are some Papuan languages that have more than 30 different possessive classes. Not noun classes, but specifically possessive classes. I'm probably not going to go that crazy, but I think the language has just sort of handed us this opportunity on a silver platter, and when something comes up in a conlang, some new avenue to explore, I think it would be folly to not go for it. But I think instead of just trying to come up with every single possible possession class now, I'm just going to see how things work out in translation. I think that would probably be the best and easiest way to do it. Also, before I forget, I have tentatively added another form to our imperatives. So the standard imperative is just the second person singular, you do something. The plural/formal imperative is you use the second person plural. And then specifically a polite form is we do something. I'm not exactly sure how these would be distinguished, or what difference in usage they would have, or what registers they would involve. But I'm still going to throw in that idea, and we'll figure out what to do with it later. So the main thing I wanted to do today was to revisit our tense aspect matrix. Because since we first drafted this thing back in episode 1, we now have a much more thorough understanding of how this language works and where the grammatical components came from, and that might mean that some of this stuff no longer quite makes sense. Like, for example, we now know that these principal parts are converbs that are formed by attaching the case suffixes. So the first principal part is an accusative, so it would have come from some old postposition that meant something like to or at, something like that. Now the dative is, I think the way we're treating it is sort of a hybrid between a dative and locative. So it could either mean something like toward or for. And then for the genitive, I think the most likely source would be something like from, especially if it's giving rise to what I think we're saying at this point is a perfective converb. But then either of these could feasibly give us an imperfective converb, but it's probably easiest and simplest to say that the accusative is what gives rise to the imperfective. But I think the dative, especially if it comes from a word like for, that immediately strikes me as a purposive converb. Forms 1 and 2 are from the locative copula, and 3 and 4 are from the standard copula. In fact, hold on. Let me just do this real quick. Okay, so this is what all of the combinations mean based on their lexical sources. So now we can just go through and track to see if they still make sense. Okay, so I stand at running, we had said was a subjunctive, which I believe we had said it was originally a future, but then it got superseded by the other future and became subjunctive. And speaking of which, we had said the purposive in this instance was the future. Like, I stand toward running. I could definitely see that being a future. It's like, I stand with the intention of running. It sort of sets it up that running is what's hopefully going to be happening soon. So I'm on board with that being a future. And in that case, I stand at running doesn't have quite a future-y feeling to it. I guess it could serve as a future. I don't know. We'll come back to that. Oh, and I did that wrong. That should be... I was getting ahead of myself. That should be stand. Yeah, I think I remember this. I think we had said that stand, at least in the non-reduplicated form, was a future auxiliary, which is why this column has such a predominantly future feeling. So if that were the case, then yeah, all of those would still make sense. So having that be a future perfect would be fine. Now this was one of the things that I wasn't totally happy with even at the time, is that this language has both a subjunctive and a conditional. I stood at running overtly just seems like a past, like an imperfective type thing, which sometimes imperfectives can become conditionals, that's a thing. But actually looking at this, I stood toward running. That comes across as much more conditional-y to me. Or at least, if it's not a full conditional, it's pretty definitively a future in the past. Like, I was going to do something. I'm going to call it future in the past for now, maybe conditional. And I stood having ran. That seems pretty likely to be a pluperfect. We may change that once we get to some of the other past tenses, like the past habitual and the remote past. But we'll call it a pluperfect for now. Now, for the standard copula, I am at running. That seems pretty present-y to me. But then, I am toward running. Does that still seem habitual? I've definitely gone back and forth about this before. Because if we remember this form, the copula came from a verb that meant to live. Because you could argue that I live at running just feels like a more permanent state than I live toward running. But on the other hand, if it's a purposive converb, then it's like I live for running. I live with the intention of running, which feels more habitual to me. For now, I'm going to stick with what we had originally. Okay, now things get kind of tricky, because there are lots of distinctions made in the past. I think it makes most sense to me if this form, since it's exactly the same as this, except you just reduplicate the auxiliary, I think that would most obviously mean just a past version of the habitual. So I'm going to stick with that. I have to say, I don't really like this idea of having an evidential baked into the tense system. I would prefer to handle evidentiality in other ways, having other verbs and phrases getting affixed on. I lived having ran seems fine for a remote past to me. It's a lot like the pluperfect, except it seems less bound. It implies a more permanent state to me, so that's fine. Now we don't have an imperfect yet, or a perfect for that matter. I think the only one that makes sense for a perfect is this one, which means that either one of these could be the imperfect. But whichever one is the imperfect, what do the other two do? Okay, random idea. If this stand auxiliary already has some futureness associated with it, then if you say, I stand at running, it's kind of a combo of present and future, which we could call an inchoative, or maybe a prospective, like I am about to do something. I guess a near future is the best way to put it. That's cool, a distinction between a near future and a further future. And then the only thing I can really think of for these two is that this live, which is just the copula, it has slightly more of a stative quality to me. So I think if we go with this one as the imperfect, then maybe this one could be like a narrative, past tense? Or some other kind of imperfective that's used differently somehow? Or we could stick with the original idea and say that this one used to be an imperfect, but then weakened and became a conditional. So that would mean we would have two different kinds of conditionals. No subjunctive though, which is good. Yeah, I think that just makes a smidge more sense. Okay, yeah, so in that case, it's largely the same as what we had before. And you know what? While we're at it, I think I'm going to go ahead and do that. Just because I think it's a little bit neater and more logical to have the present tense as form 1, and the conditional and future in the past and all of those less used ones as form 4. As I like the idea of form 1 being the sort of standard or most commonly used form. No other reason than just personal preference. In which case we better do the same thing down here before we forget. And I've fixed it on the Word document as well. Right, so now that that's done, another thing that I've been meaning to talk about for a while is copula constructions. Because we've already worked out what our copula is, because we needed to make the auxiliary verb forms work. But if you just wanted to use the copula, with a standard copula meaning of to be such and such, how does that work? By the way, I've gone ahead and made the various principal parts for the copula and the locative copula here, because in any case we're still going to need those. If you wanted to say something like, having been a student, I can tell you that it's hard work, or something like that. If you need a copula in a subordinate clause, you're going to have to use one of these. But let's say you wanted to say something like, with the nouns that we have, the woman is an ox. Or how about, if we do it the other way around, if Souther is just the default word for female, then you can say, the ox is a female. Yeah, that makes sense. So to say that, you'd have your two nouns, but what happens with the verb and or auxiliary? Because in about half of the world's languages, you have zero copula constructions, where you don't need to overtly state the copula, and it can just be omitted if it can be understood from context. And in some languages like Nahuatl, you arguably don't have a copula at all. Now in this language we definitely do have a copula because we've already used it for the auxiliaries, but is that copula mandatory in a construction like this? Or even beyond that, is an auxiliary construction mandatory? Okay, so there are three ways we could do this. Option 1, zero copula is allowed. You just put the two nouns in apposition and there you go. Option 2, you need to use the relevant form of the copula, which in this case would be... So you could say that's either a present or a habitual. We'll just go with a habitual. So that's form 1. In fact, in either case it's a form 1, so it doesn't matter. So form 1 for an animate subject is on. So this would count as one of the very, very few constructions in this language where you don't have to use an auxiliary verb construction. You can just use a copula on its own. Or, option 3, you have to use the full thing, and not only do you have to use the copula as the auxiliary, you have to use the copula again as the lexical verb. So in this case, if we're saying habitual, then we would need the second principal part. So you would need the whole thing like that. So like, the ox is while being a female. And it seems a little bit odd to use the copula twice, but that's definitely justifiable because there are instances in English where you do similar things. Like you could say something like, I have been being stupid. You can say that, right? Been being. It sounds clunky, but you can say it. Or I guess a better example is have, because you can say something like, I have had. Same sort of idea. Well, if you wanted to convey the full spectrum of tense and aspect in a copula construction, like the ox will have been female, then you would have to use the full thing with the auxiliary verb construction, because there's no other way to encode that level of specificity. So I'm going to say that's definitely allowed, but is it expected? I'm leaning towards no, just because that would make everything a fair bit longer. And I'm already conscious of the fact that these auxiliaries are going to be used a lot, because every single sentence demands them. So maybe for the sake of limiting repetition, we could say that zero copula is allowed. So if it's just for a standard statement of blank is blank, whether it's present or habitual, doesn't matter. Just these two things are the same. Or if it's just recoverable from context, what tense or time the copula applies to, then zero copula is allowed. But then the question is this construction allowed? This, I sort of want to call it a 0.5 copula construction, because the only inflection that the copula on its own takes is reduplication, which at this point in the language's history is manifested as the difference between these two forms. And the reduplicated form was historically used to encode a perfective aspect, which seems pretty likely to become a past versus non-past distinction. So you could use nan on its own to mean I am, and nidan to mean I was. And with no lexical verb, if these aren't being used as auxiliaries, you just sort of know that's what they meant. That's really interesting. Maybe that could be a form of, archaic speech, like a relic from the time when auxiliary verb constructions weren't mandatory. Yeah, I kind of like the idea that that would be kept around in at least some instances. I think if you intended to use a present meaning, then probably the zero copula construction would be the preferred way of doing it. So you would just sort of have the option of using the reduplicated form, just specifically to say that it's a past meaning. Yeah, that's kind of fun. I'll just make a note of that in the Word document. So that also goes some way to figuring out what we're going to do with this. So you may remember way back in the day, I was toying around with this idea of having a separate negative verb, essentially a verb that would mean to not be something. And that would be used in place of these auxiliaries and would have its own different matrix for what the tense and aspect implications are. Now, honestly, I still do like that idea. I've kept this chart around since then for that reason, but I've also held on to it because I thought it might be useful if we wanted to do something with lexical aspect. So in some languages, certain verbs will be restricted in what tenses and aspects they can take based on their innate implications of their tense and aspect. Like ilothwy, for example, does this a lot, where, for example, stative verbs cannot ever take the habitual. Because if you think about it, saying like, the house is big versus the house is habitually big, that doesn't really mean anything different. So that combination of stative and habitual just never happened. And you can get into much finer nuances than that if you want to. I mean, even English has some instances, so you can say, I know that, but you can't say, I am knowing that. So I was thinking maybe some verbs might do things a little bit differently than the canonical tense aspect matrix. But honestly, thinking about the way these forms came about, with the converb constructions, I'm pretty certain these converbs would be applicable to all verbs, regardless of their lexical aspects. So I think it's kind of safe to say that this matrix would apply to all verbs then. Which, I'm fine with that. If that's what the system produces, then so be it. Now, I do sort of want to get into that idea of exploring negatives now, but we are running out of time. I mean, negation is a huge topic that I think I'm going to have to think more about. Well, what I will say about negatives, while we're on the subject, I would like to have at least some degree of negative asymmetry in this language. So it's pretty common, cross-linguistically, for languages to have multiple different types of negation, depending on what's being negated. So off the top of my head, in Mandarin, the standard negative word is bu, and normally you just put bu before whatever it is you're trying to negate. But that's not the case for the verb yo, which means either to have or it can be used as a existential copula type thing. But you don't say bu yo, you say mei yo. You have this other word mei, and that's the negative that you use for yo and certain other instances as well. And one of the most common kinds of negative asymmetry is in imperatives. If I remember correctly, as many as half of all the world's languages have a separate form specifically to negate imperatives. And that usually gets called the prohibitive. So what immediately comes to mind for how we can form a prohibitive in this language is yet another converb construction. So if you wanted to say don't go, there would be some sort of negative verb, some verb that had the meaning of don't do something, something like prevent, or ignore, or fail. Actually, Mandarin has a pretty interesting one. You can use bu for imperatives as well, but you can also use bie, and bie actually comes from an old word that means to cut. So don't go would be like cut going, which we can also kind of do in English. You can say something like cut that out, and that means don't do it. So we'd have some word like that, and that would be the thing that would be marked as an imperative. And then go would be rendered as a converb. So it'd be like prevent goingly. And I think the default converb to use with that would be the first principal part, the imperfective converb, because the other ones don't make a huge amount of sense. Like prevent foregoing and prevent having gone. I guess prevent having gone maybe could have some meaning. Like make sure you haven't gone. And like other imperatives, I don't think the prohibitive will take the reduplicated form. So it'll just be the short stem plus all of these. You know what? While I'm at it, I might just do this now. All I really need to do is decide where this prohibitive verb comes from. Maybe something like take away or remove or something? If it comes from the Prohibitives, it should have a fairly basic meaning like that. Something that doesn't require us to do any derivation. So I already had this verb drafted up. Like I said, I've just been fiddling around with some more potential forms. But it's pretty simple, and I like how in the standard informal imperative it just gets reduced down to one syllable, whereas for the other more formal imperatives they're a bit longer, which is kind of what you'd expect anyway. So yeah, if we go ahead and say that that is our prohibitive verb, and we'll give it a provisional meaning of to remove or to take away, which will obviously still see a lot of use outside of the prohibitive. And so there you go, we've got our essentially prohibitive particles or auxiliaries or whatever you want to call them. So if you wanted to say don't go, or actually, what verbs do we have? So if you wanted to say don't sleep, we take the first principal part of the lexical verb. So don't sleep would be syk ilhin, whereas either don't sleep all of you, or with respect, do not sleep. That would be korok ilhin, and then please don't sleep would be tynke ilhin. And then hykke ilkin wouldn't make any sense because you can't passivize to sleep. But you get the idea. Cool, I was not expecting to get into prohibitives today, but that's kind of fun. I think next time we're going to dive into negatives properly, but I think we're running a bit too short on time to get into more negative stuff today. But before we end, just for the sake of it, I just want to get one more noun done, because we need to start growing our vocabulary some more. And for the sake of relative ease, I think I'm going to go with an inanimate noun, since they have fewer forms. We've already done rock, so I think I'm going to go for tree this time. That's another pretty solidly inanimate one, which, by the way, I do see occasionally in conlangs people putting trees in animate classes because they're alive, and that kind of makes them animate. But cross-linguistically, it's far, far more likely that they'd be lumped in with the inanimates, unless they're a particular type of plant that has some relevance or meaning to the culture. And looking through these forms, I think I actually like öste best for tree. I don't know why, but I'm really liking the vowel initial words for this language. So we'd need to get an initial O. It doesn't necessarily have to be fronted, because I realized that in at least the locative, there's going to be fronting going on from the umlaut in the suffix anyway. Now in the proto-lang, fricatives can't come as codas, so it'd have to be a vowel between the S and the T. But that means any monosyllabic suffix at the end of that will shift the stress onto that vowel between the two, which we don't want. But we can avoid that by making the final vowel longer. Okay, let's try that and see what we get. Okay, starting with the plural, because that one does not have any additional suffixes with the singulative. The unmarked form would just go to usto. The accusative would be ustos. Oh, wait, no, I forgot. Locative is identical to the nominative in inanimates. So we don't get fronting, but that's fine. And then to get the singulative, you would just stick xia at the end of those. Once again, we get syncretism between the nominative singular and the accusative plural. And then therefore that would be the same for the locative. Oh, wait a minute, no, I don't know why I did that. When the two S's come into contact, they would form a geminate, and that wouldn't roticize, it would just stay as an S. And down here, actually, the R and the S would be separated by a penthesis. There we go, that's better. And just for one last bit of fun, let's make another example sentence. Let's have a copular construction like, the rock was once a tree, which is my kind of fakey way of doing a remote past. Like, the rock used to be a tree a long time ago, but then I guess it got petrified or something? So first we take rock, and even though ostensibly this is a singular, I imagine a plural would also be acceptable here, because the idea is the singular really emphasizes singularness. So I don't think the number distinction would be as firm as it is for the other two classes. I'll go with a singular here, just for the hell of it. Then if we want to have a remote past meaning, that's form 2 combined with the third principal part. So form 2 of the copula for an inanimate subject is rahan, and the third principal part of to be, somewhat regrettably, is asse. But then between those two comes the direct object, which in this case isn't a direct object, it's a complement, of tree in the nominative, and we'll use the singular again, because if we're emphasizing that it used to be one tree. So we get irnus rahan ostos asse. And just for one last bit of fun, let's just try out an imperative, so please don't be a tree. The polite imperative is tinke. You pair that with the first principal part of the verb, which is isin. So please don't be a tree would be tinke isin osto. Cool. And with that, I think we're gonna call it a day. So thank you very much for watching. Hopefully next time we can do a proper dive into negation and sort out what that's doing. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you again in about 2 months or something.